Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our dive into the enigma of Russia, former world chess champion and democracy activist Garry Kasparov has been kind enough to call in from New York. Garry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Garry, our first guest, Peter Pomerantsev, took us into the world of Russian media and the comprehensive propaganda machine Putin has built. We focus primarily on the impact on the Russian people, but I'd like to speak with you more about Russia's impact on the world, Ukraine, the Middle East, China. Before we start, though, perhaps we can learn a little bit more about you. You came of age in the old Soviet Union as a highly honored chess champion. Share a bit of that history with us and how it colored your views.
I'm not sure, I can squeeze everything in a few sentences because you have to live through this experience of being raised on the other side of the Iron Curtain. But of course, as the chess prodigy, I had a unique privilege of traveling abroad at an very early age 13. I was sent to France to play in the under-16 World Chess Championship.
And what year was this?
1976.
Okay.
Summer 1976. And also in my family, so on one side I had my grandfather who somehow replaced my father because my father died when I was 7. So I grew up with my mother and he was in her family. And he was a diehard communist. But on the other side, I had my father's younger brother who helped me to sort of open the world of the books that were banned in the Soviet Union. So I could easily, get a sense of a very different world and about the wrongdoings of the communist system. And adding my fresh experience of traveling abroad, I could recognize the shortcomings of the Soviet regime, though I have to admit that until the time I won the world title in 1985, I still was under the impression that maybe something could be changed inside the system. So just to recognize that the entire system, starting from Lenin and not only talking about Stalin and some of the excesses of the Stalin's tyranny, but the whole system, that was rooted in my country after Bolsheviks takeover in 1917. It was dead wrong and it couldn't be fixed and it had to be simply replaced and thrown into the dustbin of history. And
what was your experience from the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89 till the fall of the Soviet Union in '91? What were you doing at that time?
At that time, I had no doubt it was all a matter of time. So I was talking about the inevitable collapse of the communist system as early as 1987 because I could see that the Soviet regime under Gorbachev was desperately trying to remain competitive with the West, but it was impossible. New communication tools like faxes and then computers, they created, a very different environment that made it impossible for Soviet Union to keep the parity with the United States and Europe. And that's why Gorbachev's desperation of making some cosmetic changes without touching the foundation of the system, for me, it was just,
wasn't going to work.
Agony.
Right. And you've since become prominent in two pro-democracy organizations, the United Civil Front and the Other Russia. What are their objectives?
But you are talking about already 2005, so we skipped,
we jumped way ahead, I know.
15 years, because I was also quite active in late 80s, early 90s, because I believed, that was my duty as one of the most famous Soviet citizens, the world chess champion, to be part of the movement, to show by personal example that, I took it very seriously and I wanted to make my own contribution to the positive change in my country. And I have to admit that in 1991, I don't think anybody who celebrated the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist regime could have imagined that 9 years later, a KGB lieutenant colonel would be back in Kremlin.
Now, it really has been quite a whirlwind. And in fact, you've had some personal costs. You've had your share of arrests and beatings at the hands of the FSB.
Yeah. I left. I dropped my professional chess career at age 41. So I thought that I already, achieved more I could have dreamed of before. And I thought that, it was my moral duty in 2005 to do whatever I could within my own country. Not that I had great expectations of winning this game. I knew that, that unlike in chess, where the rules are the same for both opponents and results are unpredictable, I knew that, it's exactly the opposite in Russia, and the Kremlin could change the rules anytime they want to preserve the result they wanted. But again, as 15 years ago, I thought that my personal example could help many people to overcome their fear. And I came up with an idea of creating sort of the united front of different political groups to agree on some limited agenda, to bring together the left-wing groups, the liberal groups, the nationalist groups, to fight for the free and fair elections, to make sure that the change of the government in Russia will be carried through the ballot, not by bullet or by repression.
And you tried to run as an opposition presidential candidate in the Russian elections in 2008, but you were stymied by the bureaucracy. Share that story with us.
Yes, but I think when people are talking about elections in Russia, I mean, they have to be very careful not to mislead the audience that is listening to this report in the free world. Because the moment you say election, people think, oh, you can register a political party, you can have a debate on television, on radio, you can write articles in newspapers, you can do the fundraising, you can have debate. I mean, none of this existed in Putin's Russia in 2007, 2008, because trying to register a political party meant that you had to get permission from Kremlin. So what I did by declaring myself a candidate was just simply sending the message. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that the system, even having total control of the political field, the system was resisting any independent candidate to appear and to pose even the smallest challenge to the ruler.
They can't tolerate it. In fact, Peter Pomerantsev pointed out earlier that many of the so-called opposition groups are just puppets of Putin.
Absolutely. And that's, by the way, made the regime so successful and sustainable against pressure from inside or outside of the country, because Putin could wear many hats. I mean, he could be a liberal, he could be a populist, he could be the nationalist, and the Kremlin always knew how to attract different groups of being in the legitimate, quote-unquote, opposition, and always trading some political capital gain in opposition for the benefits from the state.
Now, you've been warned multiple times that your life is in danger. Do you still travel to Russia?
No, I left Russia almost 2 years ago at the end of February 2013, and I didn't come back because now traveling back to Russia would be a one-way ticket for me.
Really?
And I used to buy return tickets all the time. So I was invited again, quote unquote, invited to testify at the Russian investigative committee on one of the multiple political cases that they opened in 2012, 2013. And we all know in Russia that you enter the building as a witness and you leave it if you leave it as a suspect.
Really?
So being back in Russia now means for me at best a house arrest or worse. So that's why I prefer to stay outside of the country, though it was quite a challenge since my mother is there, my son is there, and I have many relatives and friends, though during the last 2 years, many of them left the country as well.
So are you trying to get the rest of them out? Do they feel threatened as well?
No, I still hope that, it wouldn't go that far. So again, my mother keeps rather low profile. So again, my son just goes to the university. The reason I believe that they couldn't go that far is that most of the families of the Russian ruling elite is outside of Russia. So I can hardly believe that they will go that far to attack the families of
dissidents.
Opposition leaders who are outside the country. Though 2 weeks ago we saw the first very troubling sign that instead of arresting Alexei Navalny, they took his brother as hostage for nothing, that could be considered as a crime, in a kangaroo court controlled by Putin's puppets. Navalny's brother was given 3.5 years in prison, and that's the first time when they took a hostage. And that's, for me, it's unmistakable sign of totalitarian regime, because you can't discuss anymore the nature of the regime that takes hostages.
Garry, how would you define Putinism?
It's a tough question, because the moment you ask about the definition of Putinism, people are always looking for sort of historical parallels. But Putinism is a synergy of different regimes that exist in the past. So you can definitely see the elements of the corporate state of Mussolini. You can see the elements of Latin Americans, the military juntas. But in my view, the most important symptom of the regime is loyalty. It's a mafia-type loyalty. Because the promotion within the system could be a result of total loyalty to the boss. So that's what Putin could create by using unlimited financial resources. The wealth that has been created in Russia thanks to the very high energy prices. And it's a simple deal between Putin and Russian bureaucracy. So there's no crime you committed in Russia that you'll be punished except lack of loyalty.
Lack of loyalty.
And he also offered a full protection for these fortunes to be taken outside of Russia. And Putin, as the leader of the system, was always in a very good terms with foreign leaders to secure that these fortunes and also the families and the lifestyle of Russian elites outside of Russia will be protected.
Why is Vladimir Putin so popular with the Russian people?
Again, it's an interesting question, we can look at history and say that Adolf Hitler was also very popular in 1938, 39, 1940, and unfortunately, it happens with these regimes that stay for a long time and provide some food for national sentiments. But I would also caution people of buying these numbers because measuring popularity of Vladimir Putin today means that you have to go through the polling. And that means calling people and asking their opinion of Vladimir Putin. Are you sure that everybody is ready to tell to share his or her true opinion? I always say that when the polling show 80+% of support for Vladimir Putin, I'm quite amazed to see that 20% of Russians are ready,
willing to speak up,
to tell that they dislike him.
We had a brief interlude where Dmitry Medvedev was the point man. Does he have any power, or is he just a puppet?
Medvedev was a brilliant choice for Vladimir Putin because sitting in the chair of Russian president could make anybody a potential force because the chair itself, the powers, unlimited powers vested in this position could give anybody with the minimum emotions and greed for power a chance to overthrow his former master. So anything, even the smallest number multiplied by this power of the presidency could create a political force. But if you multiply 100 or 1,000 to a zero, it will end up with zero. And Putin proved to be a great psychologist by picking up somebody who was an absolute zero and who nullified all the powers of Russian presidency, despite, as we know, a pressure of some of his advisors who tried to provoke Medvedev to become a political factor.
A real source. What are Putin's grand ambitions? Does he really believe he can reassemble the old Soviet Union's footprint, or is he better understood through the lens of his own desire, as you put it, to loot as much treasure as possible?
I think Putin's passion is power. It's staying in power. And his aggression against Ukraine is, in my view, is a part of his strategy of survival. Because he's in power for too long. No, there were dictators in the 20th century that stay longer, but we're in the 21st century. And the 15 years in power is a long time. And you have to provide a new mythology for people in Russia. They have to believe that their leader is invincible. Their leader is irreplaceable. The leader is offering something absolutely unique. An economy no longer offers Putin any excuse to stay in power. The conditions, even before the sanctions, the conditions of Russian economy were not as good as before. So Putin badly needed something far more attractive. And after the success of Winter Olympics in Sochi, he believed that it was a good time for him actually to move forward and to give Russian people sort of a new sense of national honor, something to celebrate. And, if people are offered sort of a new piece of real estate for nothing, of course they are grateful for their leader who could achieve it.
Was the war in the Ukraine planned, or was it just opportunistic?
No, I think it was planned. It's just we have to recognize that the operation of annexing Crimea was carried almost perfectly within a very short period of time, and these kind of operations are planned in advance. My gut feeling is that they planned it for 2015, providing Yanukovych would be losing presidential elections, and that was quite realistic assessment. And then I think the annexation of Crimea and probably the further aggression in eastern Ukraine, that was already just one of the cards that Putin would have played.
What is his endgame in the Ukraine? What does he want to end up with?
I think at one point, after such an easy, annexation of Crimea, I think he planned to move further, and he talked about it. In numerous speeches, he talked about Novorossiya, about, the 8 Ukrainian regions in the east and southeast of the country. And also he wanted to have a corridor to Transnistria in Moldova, while it's also the rebellion region that is close to Russia politically, and Russia supplied it for a long time. And he thought about, just
rebuilding the buffer states.
It's a buffer state, and also he never believed that Ukraine was a real state. I think it's that deep down, I think he believed that Ukraine was a historical mistake, and he wanted to restore what he believed was a justice. And by the way, I think in many of his moves, he reminded me of Adolf Hitler, because psychological portraits are quite similar. Hitler also wanted, to be friends with England, with the British Empire, because he believed that they could work together, and providing Hitler had a full freedom of dealing with the countries east of Germany.
Well, they fooled Chamberlain.
Putin also wanted to be friends with America, providing he would be given, free hand in the former Soviet Union, because he believed that he had to be granted these rights and to, take over countries or regions, or put pressure on them, or to put a puppet governments at a time when it suits his political agenda.
How effective have President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry been dealing with the Ukraine crisis?
It's a disaster. But I think the entire foreign policy concept, when they want to negotiate at any cost, it proved to be disastrous. Because you can have deals every day. It's every breakfast you can make a deal if you give up everything. So what we could see with North Korea, with Iran, with Cuba, proves time and again that Obama's administration is willing to give up everything for a flashy headline in a newspaper or a big press conference. But it's not about making statements. It's not about, gaining some short-term advantages. It's about long-term future. It's about statesmanship. And there's no statesmanship in the actions of this administration.
What about European leaders? Has Angela Merkel done any better?
Angela Merkel is the only European leader that does understand Putin's nature. She was born and raised in East Germany, so she should not be told about about Putin's promises and about the KGB style operations. But she's under heavy pressure from their own government, because the foreign policy office is controlled by the socialists. It's a coalition government, and it's influenced by Gerhard Schröder and his group. And Schröder for a long time has been on Putin's payroll.
Really?
German business also is willing to do more in Russia, and naturally there are very close ties. France is now playing a role of the mediator, and it seems to me that French President François Hollande is willing to have a seat at the new Yalta conference to divide up Ukraine with Putin. And because there will be 80th anniversary of this event in Yalta, when Roosevelt and Churchill
carved up the world.
Give up Eastern Europe under Stalin's pressure. But they were facing Stalin. I'm not trying to find an excuse for their actions, but it was a very different world, and Stalin was no Putin.
History does repeat itself. So speaking of which, let me ask you a question that was often asked in the early career of Adolf Hitler. Does Putin control the oligarchs, or do the oligarchs control him?
No, Putin controls everything right now in Russia. Putin is a dictator, and it's not even one-party dictatorship. It's a one-man dictatorship. That's why comparing him to Stalin or Hitler would be a correct one, because he is in charge. And I don't think that oligarchs, that's the name that has been celebrated for so long in the free world as, the symbol of all-powerful Russian magnates, it is a great deal of an illusion. Yes, they are very rich, and many of them, have a massive fortune outside of Russia. But as for the influence for Russian politics, I doubt very much that any of them or even group of them would be willing to take on Vladimir Putin, who controls security apparatus, and who is much stronger as a political leader because Putin has a vision. It's a crazy vision, and he's willing to
go all the way,
to go as far as it's necessary to complete his vision. While these groups depend on Putin's success, since they see no guarantees for them in the future without Putin.
You've called Putin more dangerous to the United States than the Islamic State. Now, why is that? I mean, at the end of the day, what do American people care if Ukraine disappears? Look,
what is the Islamic State now? There are many Islamic states. Yes, I'm not trying to undermine the danger coming from these from maniacs and these people who are willing to behead, Americans, Britons, French men, or whoever. But it's a regional threat, and it all depends on America's or European political will, to put enough resources, whether it's boots on the ground or some technological assistance to Kurds or to Iraqis. So it's a problem that has a solution. Vladimir Putin's problem has no military solution because Putin controls nukes, the second largest nuclear arsenal. And while Putin is there, it's like having the spider in the center of the web. He's a ringleader of this evil network. And every day Putin survives, he poisons the global atmosphere because it is sending signals to other facts in the world that America is not all powerful, and Vladimir Putin is there, to help them.
He can get away with it.
Absolutely. And to come up either directly to their help, as he did with Assad, or to use his powers to protect indirectly, as it happens, for instance, with North Korea or Iran.
So how long can Putin hold up if oil stays under $50 a barrel, and what's the best way to bring him down?
What I want to see now is to Western leaders to stop worrying about Putin being so weak, because it's not about Russia getting weaker. It's about Putin's regime going down, and keeping sanctions in place, making sure that the West is serious about protecting the world order as we knew it from 1945, when the borders are intact and big states cannot attack smaller states without paying a heavy price for NATO aggression. If this message has been carried through and Russian elite and Russian public hears it loud and clear, I believe the days of Putin's regime are numbered, and it may happen even sooner than anybody expects.
Garry, you've given us so much to think about. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for listening to the message.
That was former chess champion and democracy activist Garry Kasparov here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. That wraps up our show for this week. We'd like to welcome our newest listeners in San Francisco on KNEW 960 AM and KOSF 103.7 FM HD2. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.